Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Dustin Byrd, a professor of philosophy and religion at the University of Olivet. I'm also the founder of the publishing house Ekpyrosis Press, as well as the founder and co-director of the Institute for Critical Social Theory. Today I have with us Ali Harfouch, who is the author of the new book entitled Against the World, Towards an Islamic Liberation Philosophy. And we want to discuss that book today. So I have a lot of questions for you. So thank you for joining us, Ali.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So I've known you for quite some time, but you're probably new to quite a few of the people who are watching this video. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I completed my bachelor's degree in political science from the American University of Beirut, and then I did my master's degree at the same university in political studies. So I was born and raised in New Jersey, in the suburbs. And then in 2008, I traveled to the suburbs were very alienating, very constricting and whatnot. Especially for somebody who's interested in politics in the Muslim world and whatnot. And so in 2008, I moved to Lebanon with the intention of becoming more politically engaged with the Muslim world. And I had the pleasure and the honor of working with different Islamic movements for 10 years, different trajectories of thought. And during that time, I lectured, wrote, and engaged with these Islamic movements. Yeah, so that's the gist about myself.
Nice. So in many ways, you have a foot in both worlds, the
Yes.
Western American world and the Islamic world.
Yes.
Very nice, very nice. So what was your motivation to write this book?
So basically, during the time that I was with these Islamic movements, there were two phases. Okay, pre-Arab Spring and post-Arab Spring. Pre-Arab Spring, I had been engaged with these Islamic movements, with literature having to do with Islamic liberation philosophy, Islamic thought, contemporary Islamic issues and whatnot. And then the Arab Spring happened. So everything that we had been looking at in theory suddenly became concrete, lived issues. And one of the questions that emerged following the Arab Spring, which took everybody by shock, including these Islamic movements, was the question, what is to be done? And one of the things that I found lacking is that there was, at least in the global north, in the United States and the Atlantic European landscape, that there was a lack of thinking about what type of liberation philosophy would inform that question, what is to be done? And in particular, in what ways does Tawhid, the unicity of God, tell us something about what is to be done? So what I am trying to do in this book is try to articulate an Islamic liberation philosophy that informs the praxis of Islamic movements. Because in many ways, I believe that the Arab Spring is an ongoing, unfolding process that has not ended. So that was my motivation behind writing the book, in addition to wanting to engage with Latin American liberation theology, in particular the works of Enrique Dussel, and to try to put Enrique Dussel in conversation with thinkers like Ali Shariati, among others.
And so what you just say, the core thesis of your book is rooted in the concept of Tawhid, this oneness of
100%.
God?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. And then,
core of it is.
So that's that theological concept, which is obviously the core of the Qur'an. It's the core message of the Islam, in and of itself. It has political ramifications. It has economic implications. It has social and cultural implications. And so how does, for you, in how you formulate it in your book, how does Tawhid saturate all these different parts of life?
So the way I conceive of Tawhid is in three different registers. The first is a philosophy of reality, that is to say, a philosophy of creation. Second is a mode of critical consciousness, metaphysical critical consciousness. And third, as a praxis. So, praxis here has to do with the different fields that you mentioned: political, economic, social, cultural, and whatnot. However, the praxis that informs so the praxis related to these different fields is grounded in, or ought to be grounded in, Tawhid as a philosophy of reality and Tawhid as a metaphysical critical consciousness. Now, when we speak of a philosophy of reality, what I mean is a philosophy that engages with our lived history rather than merely a philosophy that engages with theological questions such as the theological questions that have dominated Islamic intellectual history, such as the names and attributes of God, the question of predestination, the question of free will, and whatnot. So that's why I begin by referring to Tawheed as a philosophy of reality to try to distinguish it or try to highlight that Tawheed as a philosophy very much has to do with our lived history, our concrete history, rather than just what it's been reduced to in what's called Ilm al-Kalam, which is scholastic philosophy and dialectic philosophy.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, you know, the title of your book is Against the World.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a lot of people, I think, when they read something like that, it seems wholly negative. It seems like you're against the world, it's nihilistic, you know what I mean? And therefore, it can lend itself to some very, you know, violent movements or something like that. But I think philosophically, it always seemed to me that the phrase against the world is very similar to what Western philosophers would call negative philosophy or negative, even theologians,
Mm-hmm.
theology,
Okay, yeah.
that they're against the world as it is, with its, you know, barbarity, with its injustices, you know what I mean? That
Yes.
from a Christian articulation, they would say, you know, the kingdom or the empire of Rome is not the kingdom of God, right?
Yeah.
The distinction between what is and what ought to be the case. Is
Yeah.
that how you mean against the world?
Yeah. So I mean against the world in two senses. The first is in the sense that you spoke of, that against the world as it is, which is a world that is a world that has been recreated in the image of a secular order, in the image of an oppressive order. The second sense where I speak about against the world is the argument that I make in my book that Islam is essentially a revolt against the dunya, right? So in the Quran differentiates between two different ways of being in the world. You have the dunya, which refers to the lowly world, the world of diversion, the world of alienation, the world of concealment, the world that alienates man from himself and from God and from the cosmos. And then the Quran differentiates between that and between the alam, which refers to the totality of existence, the cosmos, which includes the world, and the ways in which the totality of those existence points to a creator. So essentially, what I'm arguing for is that we need to transcend the world as dunya and to enter the world as the creative space that the Quran refers to as al-alam. So essentially, the core thesis is that Islam is a revolt against the meta order, which is the dunya, that grounds and legitimizes oppressive orders, for example, the secular order, the capitalist order, the white supremacist order, and so forth.
Right, right, for sure. Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a really, you know, it's not it's an argument that I think in so many ways connects with the prophetic, the deeply prophetic in Islam, as opposed to the reified, you know, institutions and things like that. But it goes back to that original spirit of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba at the very beginning of the Islamic tradition. This uprising, this rebellion against
Yes. Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm,
world
mm-hmm.
of you know, Jahiliyyah, of the age of
Yeah.
ignorance that came in from. And it always seems like, you know, I think philosophers like yourself or whatnot are able to in many ways resurrect that spirit, but connect it to modernity,
Yes.
because the problems of
Exactly.
modernity are same as they were then, but different.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
the critique is the same, but different.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So basically, exactly. So one of the ideas behind the book is to look at the Tawhid that animated the first Islamic movement, which is the prophetic movement. How does that inform our age of modernity and our age of coloniality and our age of fetishization and whatnot? So it's an attempt to revive the the spirit of liberation that informed the first Quranic generation or the first Islamic movement that began in Mecca.
Right, right. So it's a project of tajdid, of renewal,
Yes, exactly,
or
exactly.
renovatio in Latin.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. So, one of the things that I think the whole world is dealing with right now is the hegemony of the neoliberal world order, the
Hmm.
economics of it, the politics of it, the hypocrisy of it. Let's be honest. Do you think that this neoliberal world order is an existential threat to the ummah, to the Muslim community around the world?
Hmm. Yes, because the when we think about the existential as opposed to merely the political, economic, and whatnot. When you think about the existential, we are referring here to the ways in which this existential threat creates a state of alienation of man from himself, an alienation of man from God, and an alienation of man from the cosmos or the alam and whatnot. So I think neoliberalism par excellence emerged out of the secular order, the secular logic of the world as a space of pure power. And what neoliberalism does essentially is alienates the Muslim self from itself um, through the illusion of freedom, through the illusion of self-affirmation. And when I speak about the alienation of man from himself or the self from itself, as Kierkegaard would have put it, it's the alienation, what neoliberalism essentially achieves as a mode of world making, not merely as an economic phenomena. So when we speak about alienation of the self from itself, it's an alienation of man from his ontological characteristics, which is freedom and choice, and man as a primordial being that is in relation to God or the Muslim self. So the alienation is twofold. An alienation of man from his ontological capacities, which is what differentiates him from the animal kingdom, and an alienation of man from the Muslim self and the Muslim self ontological vocation, which is al-istikhlaf, divine stewardship, divine stewardship and whatnot. And neoliberalism achieves this in multiple ways. The first is the penetration of consciousness through big data and customization. Okay. The second is, for example, through the recreation of the forging of new subjectivities, the creation of a new sense of Muslim self, which is which some marketing companies now refer to as Generation M, a generation that is solely concerned with consumption, production, and competition. And then in the third sense of alienation that is wrought by neoliberalism is the erosion of the Muslim self. So the reduction of the Muslim as a Muslim from to the Muslim as an ambiguous, to the Ummah as an ambiguous mass of individuals that have no spiritual or political uh, connection and whatnot. So here, Byung-Chul Han, for example, differentiates between the authentic self-same and the totalizing same. So the authentic self same is the way is a collectivity of individuals who have a form, right? Who have some sort of form. They are integrated, right? They are collectively oriented towards some sort of project or some sort of future. Whereas the totalizing same refers to a mass sprawl of individuals that are alienated from one another. So another important point to make when we think about neoliberalism is that more than often, the critique of neoliberalism has been an economic critique. One of the things that I try to do in my book is to engage in a metaphysical critique of neoliberalism. That's one, and two, um, um, linking or establishing the genealogy of neoliberalism by looking at the ways in which it emerges from secularism. right? And secularism is more than just separation of church and state. It is a metaphysical commitment to the sovereignty of the world, and it reconceives of the world as a space of pure power. And it reconceives and it recreates this image of the world as a sealed off totality, and subsequently it looks at the political and economic space as sealed off autonomous fields, that are stripped of any relationship to the divine and whatnot. So it is only through the secular idea of an autonomous economic space that and the world as a sealed off totality that neoliberalism could have emerged. So in order to engage in a thorough critique of neoliberalism, we also need to engage in a critique of secularity, basically.
Yeah, no, that I think you're onto something there. Absolutely. Something's absolutely true. And in secularity, I think, for a lot of, I'm living in the West. I've been through part of lots of the world, and secularity in sometimes in some places was revolutionary,
Yeah.
especially in the West. And in other places, secularity can be deeply oppressive. And I've talked to people here many times, many people I know here in the West who have that crisis of meaning, living in the neoliberal hegemonic type of existence, and they have a crisis of meaning. And and this is something that even Nietzsche, of course, talked about in his God is Dead thesis, that
Yeah.
this crisis is coming, it's on its way. And for some people, it has been, how do you deal with that crisis where you go back to religion? For other people, it's not religion, you just deal with it. You deal with it, you find meaning, subjective meaning in your own projects and things like this in your own family, but there is no collective meaning for anything. That might be more the West perspective, or at least what the condition of the West is. And to a certain extent, that is creeped into the Muslim world. And some people who would identify themselves as Muslim but are secular would say that that's a good thing, and other ones would say, no, this is not us. This is not part of our spirit. This is not part of our culture or civilization. And these people might not even be deeply religious, but they still cling to this idea that meaning is connected to an ultimate sovereign. And because it's connected to that ultimate sovereign, we have to live a certain way. And living a certain way means we have to live in a form of a community.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And whereas here, I think it's more normative in the West that, we not only not know our neighbors, we generally dislike them.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is deeply like un-Islamic, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where the neighbor is, I mean, how do you live out your deen, but being with the neighbor and working with the neighbor, loving the neighbor, being there for the neighbor. And I think that these basic values, which in the West are oftentimes called conservative values, I don't think they're conservative values. I think they're deeply humanistic values. And as humanistic values, they're deeply Islamic values as well. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, so in working in your book, you've tied these Islamic principles that are in many cases traditional Islamic principles, but you've also tied them with other type of thinkers. So you seem to be comfortable going back and forth between Islamic philosophy or theology and Western philosophy and theology. In your book, you're citing thinkers like Ali Shariati, who you mentioned already, Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Atas, Abdul Hakim Sherman Jackson, great scholar, American scholar. Western thinkers like Alain Badiou, Enrique Dussel, as you already said, Paul Tillich, as well as even Russian theologian, philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev. Why do you think it's important that contemporary Muslim thinkers can do this, that they can be a bridge between the Islamic intellectuals and the Western intellectuals, and not just ghettoize themselves in one or the other?
So I think if we look at the history of Islamic intellectual thought, we find that there has never been in early Islamic thought, there was never this fear or hesitancy from engaging with other philosophies. So we have a very rich history of critically engaging with Greek philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, Persian philosophy, and whatnot. And what emerged from that engagement was an intellectual history that was marked by penetrative discursive depth, very rich traditions, Al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Juwayni, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and whatnot. Now, something happened, perhaps with modernity, or in the 19th century, 18th century, where suddenly Muslims were put on the defensive and found themselves unable to critically engage with other philosophies. So one of the things that I try to do in this book is say, okay, no, we need to go back to this critical spirit of engagement and inquiry and engage with new strands of thought. In the same way we engage with Greek philosophy, why don't we engage with liberation theology? Why don't we engage with critical theory? Why don't we engage with decoloniality? Now, this might, and I say that the engagement has to be critical in the sense that we should not blindly appropriate and try to absorb their concepts, but engage in a way where on the one hand we understand what are our normative commitments, our metaphysical commitments, and as such engage with these philosophies, engage with these trajectories of thought, especially because these philosophies, liberation theology, and for example, critical theory, they were engaged with the experience of capitalist exploitation and authoritarianism. And this is a shared experience that is also very much part and parcel of the Muslim world. So in what ways did those philosophies engage with the realities that are also realities in the Muslim world? I think it's important that we engage with those philosophies in order to illuminate our own understanding of our experience of capitalist exploitation and oppression.
For sure, it makes sense. It always reminds me of the story of Jürgen Habermas, the critical theorist, when he traveled to Iran. He was invited to go to Iran and get some lectures on philosophy, and he got there, and as far as I was told the story, he got there and he was absolutely amazed by all these scholars, all these faculty in these universities, Iranian universities, who were reading critical theory, who were reading, Habermas's work, who were reading Foucault, who were reading all the pantheon of Western philosophers. And there was a certain level of embarrassment there because Western philosophers don't read,
Yes.
Muslim philosophers, and they don't read the philosophers from outside of the West. And that's a big problem because, again, now this big empty hole that they don't understand that, oh my God, this idea that is now a rage in Western philosophy. Well, it's already been talked about, discussed, thoroughly debated in other parts of the world, just not in Western languages, So one of the things I think is important, like your book and others like you, is that it's showing the overlap where there's an overlapping consensus or engagement with the problems, like you're talking about, the engagement with capitalism and exploitations, whatnot. And that is a good reason as to why Muslim intellectuals should be Westerners and vice versa. It's time that the West, de-ghettoize, if you will, narcissistically keeping themselves in this ghetto, and read scholars outside of Western scholars. I mean, do you think that's the case? Do you think that's true?
100%. And I think it's the responsibility of the intellectual, right? It's the responsibility of the Muslim intellectual to begin to build that bridge with these critical philosophies. But at the same time, I think that in addition to the Western academia overcoming its own hubris, its own sense of as though it is this imperial ego that somewhat hovers above philosophies and above the world and is able to make itself aloof to other perspectives. I think another responsibility of the Muslim intellectual is to begin to critically engage with depth to the problematics that are being engaged with in Western academia or in Western thought. So, for example, you find little work among Muslim intellectuals who are largely secular, right? Um, with concepts such as alienation, authoritarianism, um, class structure, and whatnot. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's difficult, for example, for Muslims in the global north to engage with Islamic philosophy, contemporary Islamic thought, because there is a lack of discursive depth, as Omir Anjam puts it, especially with most Islamic movements. So as a result of this absence of engagement with contemporary issues and the lack of discursive depth, Muslims in the global north, or perhaps even Western academics, don't find many resources that they can engage with to begin with, right? Um, the discursive depth has been an exception rather than a rule, right? Ali Shariati, Sayyid Qutb, Muhammad Qutb, and whatnot. So I think it's a responsibility of the Muslim intellectual to begin to deeply and critically engage with the same issues that the global north is dealing with.
For sure, especially, you know, in the modern world where, whether it's thanks to neoliberalism or not, we're increasingly becoming a smaller world.
Yeah.
You know, in the ways in which we are interconnected through technology, through basic things like friendship. I mean, so many people now in living in the West can say, I have friends in these other parts of the world.
Yeah.
That might be the good side of social media. There's certainly a negative side to it too. But I think you're absolutely right that the hubris of the West is slowly decaying, I think, in academia, which is good in many cases in American academia. I see it even more so than in European academia. But you know, we have to get over this feeling of, I think you're right, the imperial, we know better, we create it here, it trickles down to everyone else. So for instance, I was once told this by a friend in Germany. He said, philosophy is created in Germany, corrected in Britain, and corrupted in the US.
Mm.
Which, whatever, there may be some truth to that, but that which is not said in that statement is about anyone else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So philosophy doesn't come from anywhere else but the West. It's a Western affair.
Yeah.
You know, and that's deeply problematic, I think, which you've shown in your book by being able to weave, you know, concepts and categories and principles and ideals from both of these worlds, the Muslim world and the Western world, together in this deeply critical and I think very prophetic a book that's dealing with the world as it is now in the condition that it is. Are you hopeful for the future?
Yes, definitely. I think that um, the Islamic movement is evolving. And I think that the Muslim world has largely overcome certain barriers, such as the authoritarian bargains, for example, and the phenomena of fear. So I am very hopeful for the future. I think that the Islamic project uh, 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 and Islamic movements will evolve towards a more critical, liberatory, and it will inaugurate new horizons and new futures for the Muslim world. But I think it's an ongoing process, and it's like childbirth. It will only emerge from very traumatic, painful experiences, but I think something positive will emerge from that, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, I think you're right. Just in, you know, when I first started teaching at the collegiate level as an undergrad, and my students knew nothing about Muslims, the Muslim world. My first class I ever taught at the university level was in the fall of 2001.
Mm,
So you can imagine September
yeah,
of 2001. And now I see students, you know, like I said, who have friends who are from Palestine, who are from Lebanon, who are from Egypt, who are from Indonesia and Pakistan, and on and on and on. And I think that has helped this to raise the consciousness, at least in this younger generation here in the US, about the value of human diversity. Uh,
mm,
and then I think that's tremendously helpful.
yeah, 100%.
So we have come to our we're getting towards the end. Is there anything else you want to say about your book?
No. I would love the reader to critically engage with the text, read it critically, and you know, give me constructive feedback in terms of ways in which I can further articulate certain concepts. So criticism is very much welcome and would be greatly appreciated.
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Critique is the way we sharpen our intellectual skills.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So once again, this is Ali Harfouch in talking about his new book, Against the World, which is published by Ekpyrosis Press, and I will make sure I put the information on how to purchase the book in the description in this video. And so please do check it out. It's an amazing read, very eye-opening, very challenging in such a ways that it will expand your horizon into how you think about these things. So thank you, Ali, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dustin, for having me.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.